Zucky gave this to me. I don't really know why, but I am wearing it now. It's the modular mullet. Okay. I showed this talk to no one, so I'm going to try to tell the story that I think kind of defines sovereignty and modularity, kind of the hopeful part of it and the challenging part, and how we are trying to add a little bit more hope and help sovereignty win. So the first part of this story is that building sovereign is like going to space and settling the galaxy. In traditional crypto ecosystems, your ecosystem is your ceiling. If you let another protocol project team define your relationship with your users and decide where they come from, that will be as large as you can be. And maybe that works initially, it's a great way to start, but over time, folks' ambition grows beyond that. We've seen that with a number of the projects that have migrated from Ethereum to Cosmos. And the problem here is that those limits are a lot lower than people think. So let's take a look at like Arbitrum, Optimism. The most successful ETH L2s that exist are both worth $7 billion today. And that might sound like a pretty high limit. You might be thinking, oh, Uniswap is $6 billion, $1 billion outcome is extraordinary. But in practice, the limit is a lot lower than that. Let's take a look at the Uniswap example, right? $6 billion sounds epic. It uses 50% of block space on Ethereum. It controls billions and billions of dollars of liquidity. It is the most successful decentralized crypto protocol that exists, hands down, but it is built in an ecosystem that is worth $400 billion. It is a tiny, tiny fraction of that ecosystem, despite that massive level of success. And so your ceiling is not $7 billion building in someone else's ecosystem. It's much, much lower. It's 1% of that. So the problem is that if you are building in a traditional ecosystem, you are just mathematically not traditionally venture backable. Your best outcome is $100 million. And compare that to building sovereign. Let's take a look at the Cosmos ecosystem. Everybody kind of thinks of Cosmos as Atom and as that potentially being the limit, but look at Celestia. Celestia showed up, built the Cosmos SDK chain. Today, it's worth 3 times that. Atom didn't impose a limit on Celestia. And that's the difference between building sovereign and building in someone else's ecosystem. You don't have this kind of limitation because you are establishing your own relationships with your users. You are not reusing and rehypothecating someone else's. And I'm not one of those people who's like, oh, building L1 is the only way to be sovereign. I think there's tons of different ways to achieve this. And I think the way folks go about it depends on what they're looking for. But this is the really exciting thing to me about sovereignty, that you have no limits. It's like going out, settling the stars, and building in someone else's ecosystem is a lot more like walking down the road and establishing a corner store. It is maybe a good business to start with, but you can't raise venture funding for that, and you're not going to be able to grow. So why don't we all do this, and why isn't this the way everyone is building? First of all, I think many, many folks are building this way now, but there are a ton of problems. And the main one is this idea around public goods. So these are going to be like our sovereign chains. They're all special and different. Everybody's kind of like a snowflake. There's some similarities between some of them. We got 2 pink chains, we got 2 yellow chains, we got 2 blue chains, but everybody's their own shape. There's very little commonality, and that makes shared efforts, that makes public goods really, really hard to build. It becomes very challenging to get anyone to focus on that. Cosmos knows this, so the Cosmos SDK is used by 130 chains. Massively successful open source project, secures billions and billions of dollars of capital. And there are only 6 chains that have developers that contribute back to it. 6. And there's only 1 chain that helps to fund it. And that's Atom. Shout out Atom. Whatever you want to say about Atom, but they actually do help to fund it. This is an enormous problem. Ethereum is finding out that this is really hard too. This is one of my favorite examples. Last year, there was kind of a unified call for action from a bunch of bridges working in the interop space. And they all kind of got together and said, interop and Ethereum is getting much harder. All these different kinds of chains are being built, all these different kinds of bridges. Like, we need standards. And like, nothing came of this. It's completely fizzled out. And that's because when you aren't unified around a single token, public goods are really, really hard. This is very much most deeply felt in interop. So these are our chains again. Now we have these little lines between them. These are bridges. All the bridges are also different. And it's really hard, yes, because it's the space between chains, but it's also really hard because every chain secretly, deep down, just wants to be a liquidity black hole. We all want it to be easy to get money into our chain and extremely hard to get it out. And that creates a really bad system from the perspective of someone who just wants to move around to use applications. I think one thing that is worth noting is that Ethereum mainnet has been excellent at this, has done this tremendously well. The fact that it is extremely expensive to transact on Ethereum has made routing assets through it very challenging. The fact that there's a 16-minute finality time has made getting out really challenging. You need to rely on market makers who don't have a choice. So Ethereum is an excellent black hole, but everybody else wants that. Everybody looks at that and they're like, that's good. Like, they're worth $400 billion. They've figured something out. I know this is like the chain abstraction track or whatever, but chain abstraction does not solve this problem. Chain abstraction potentially helps us get better user experiences, but the way that we get those user experiences is by building these kinds of protocolized middlemen and enshrining them and letting them have relationships with the users. And we're doing that in a situation where there's extremely strong network effects, there's strong economies of scale, there's strong switching costs, and that leads to an enormous opportunity to monopolize this kind of off-chain closed space. This is a picture from a 1907 magazine about the telephone industry depicting AT&T as this growing, grasping octopus spreading out across the United States, giving all of these cities connectivity, but also massively constricting them and massively overcharging users. So this is, from my perspective, like deep down secretly what all interop protocols want. They all emulate AT&T. I know we at Skip do. And I think the challenge here is that connectivity to users and connectivity to liquidity is so important that we can't let this kind of thing happen. And this is an enormous threat to sovereignty. I'm going to run through just a few examples to kind of prove this point. So the token bridge octopus wants to become canonical money, and that's how it performs rent extraction. So it connects you to everyone else over these kind of standardized bridges that seem really nice, and that's all great. And then the money makes its way into all of the DeFi protocols and all of the chains, and then all of a sudden the transaction fees can go up, and the money that's on your chain isn't actually yours or your users. It belongs to this third thing. Solver networks are the same way, though they operate differently. Here, the solver network shows up and says, you know, don't worry about trying to find your way around this like complicated route of bridges that's far too complex. You could never possibly figure that out. We'll give you just the one direct path. You don't have to worry about it. Like, don't worry about how it happens. And that sounds pretty good. And then we start to have a nice network effect around more solvers showing up and them offering better prices and that attracting more order flow. And pretty soon the fill cost is much lower than other folks' fill cost. And everything is great, but that difference becomes the rent. Balance abstraction, chain signatures, all that stuff is really hot right now. These things are also just octopuses seeking to cut off users from protocols. So The way this works is we say, okay, it's really hard to figure out how to move assets between these different chains and how to sign for all of them. They've got different kinds of signature algorithms. So let's just move the users over to this other thing. Let's store their assets in this other thing. Let's have the permissioning layer move over here. And then there's one kind of standardized way that you can sign on all these things. But pretty soon, that thing also becomes the octopus. Says, okay, now you want access to your users, you're going to have to pay more. So in each of these scenarios, we have a situation where the applications, the things that we're trying to build that are supposed to be useful, that are supposed to provide value to users, are being disintermediated from their users and from their liquidity by a middleman. And it can be a protocolized middleman, but because we're off-chain, there's so much complexity here, so much of it gets pushed into the dark edges and pushed off to market makers that this becomes a real threat. So I think there's a lot that we can do to fix this, and this is really what Skip is dedicated to, is trying to make sure that we can have sovereignty without these kinds of protocolized middlemen. And there's kind of 4 steps that I'm just going to walk us through. The first one is permissionless interop protocols are a great start. So Hyperlane, IBC, things like that don't require anybody to show up and say, fine, yes, you can launch. And I think Axelar and a number of these other bridges are starting to work on permissionless interop too, which is super exciting. That means that we can have these 2 sort of separate sections of chains that don't have bridges between them, and somebody can just plop one down without asking anyone and connect them and create kind of global connectivity. Now, this is not the whole story. This mess on the left is still really quite hard to navigate, and there's a lot of steps between I'm imagining I want to move from one chain to another to actually making it happen that the permissionless interop protocols do not solve. So the second step, and this is what we're working on at Skip right now, is to create a fully open sourced end-to-end platform to actually handle all of these off-chain pieces and aggregate over all of these routes. So we start from the user saying, I have token A on chain B and I want to go to lazy chain and buy a sloth, and we end with actually relaying their data there after searching over all of the different paths that we can do that. Solver networks, traditional token bridges, DEXs, combining them into one single user action, one single click, and then wrapping that into an API that developers can use. And this being open source is incredibly important for us being accountable to our integrators. It means that if we start any of this kind of octopus behavior, they can fork it, run it themselves, extend it, do whatever they want. They do not have to rely on us. Now, that's still really quite hard to do, but now we can go anywhere, right? We don't have to turn to these complex off-chain systems, and even if we want to, now the logic by which they operate can be brought into the public and can be made accessible for anyone to use and access, and we'll have more fair, more open, cheaper solver networks that are accessible to anyone. And now this whole complexity of I need to go through 3 different bridges, I need to figure out where to swap and what to do, it's all just automated and it all just works. Skip offers this today, but we're not yet open source. We're working on that. The next step though is that, like I said, it's still really hard to run that thing. So our aggregation platform is almost 200,000 lines of code. It's spread across 6 different microservices that all take care of one of those individual parts that I was showing before. And it's really quite challenging to run and keep up, and that is another source of centralization. So what we need to do is make it actually verifiable that we're running it correctly, or whoever is running it correctly, and ensure that the user's privacy can be protected when people are interacting with this thing. There's a bunch of different ways to go about that. This idea of putting it in a TE is one that we talk a lot about on the team, and we're starting to explore, but we're excited about exploring others too. What this gives us is it guarantees that when we are optimizing over these different bridges and these different routes and solvers, that we're doing it fairly, and it ensures the users are actually having their preferences respected. If they want the fastest route or they want the cheapest route, they know that that's exactly what they're going to get, and that we're not cutting side deals with anyone to change that. So we're pretty close now. We have permissionless bridges that we can deploy anywhere. We've got an open system that allows us to navigate those permissionless bridges, and now we have a mechanism that makes it such that anyone can run that system, and we don't have to trust that individual entity or that person. But the problem with all of the octopuses is kind of none of these things. Many of them are open, many of them are on chain, or they could try to become more that way. It's actually governance. It's actually accountability. It's ensuring that after you've built that network effect and after you have that scale economy, you remain aligned with your users and your integrators. And so the last step, again, we are trying to answer questions about how to do this, is that you need to make the platform actually governable by the people who make it valuable, which is something we talk a lot about in crypto. We think a lot about this. We talk about read, write, own, and things like that. But in practice, almost every protocol is governed by its token holders, not its users, not the people who are making the network valuable. And those folks' incentives and what they want is different. They want the token to go up. And if at some point that means rent extraction, that's what they're going to do. That is the same problem that we're having in Web 2 with these traditional large networks. And it's the same problem that we're going to have in the sovereign web if we don't kind of solve this problem. And what we're really excited about is trying to think about how we can create governance systems that give integrators and users who create the order flow the opportunity to govern the system, to help set the fees, to help elect operators to it. Same for the protocols and the solvers and the LPs who are actually filling those orders, and same for the developers who are submitting contributions to the system for the paths and the routes that are most used. We don't know how to do this yet, in the same way we don't yet know how to make the system verifiable. We're starting, like I said, today with working on the open source component of it. But we want to invite everybody to come and help us answer these questions. We're going to be building in the public. We're going to be building with a bunch of Cosmos teams, a bunch of roll-up teams, folks like the Celestia team and the Astria team, trying to answer these questions so that we can have an open and fair system, and that to ensure that access to liquidity and users remains something that isn't a barrier to sovereignty and isn't something that other protocols can abuse. So, thank you.